What is Next.js? What are some prerequisites of Next.js, or what should you know before you start with the Next.js? What are some main features of Next.js? And what are maybe some examples of those different features? Well, in today's video, it's going to be a complete getting started guide for absolute beginners in Next.js. And even if you are more kind of intermediate with Next.js, I think some of these things are good kind of concepts to go over, as you know, I've been using Next.js for a couple of years, and I work as a full-time professional, more so front-end focused developer, and I really like Next.js. And even for me, kind of going back over some of these fundamentals to create this guide, it was beneficial to kind of go over some of these basics. So let's kind of get started here with what is Next.js? Well, as it says right here at the Next.js docs, and let me show my URL here so you can see I'm just at nextjs.org, but it is a React framework for the web. So effectively, it is a framework for React.js that allows you to build full stack web applications. So as you can see here, Next.js enables you to create full stack web applications by extending the latest React features and integrating powerful Rust-based JavaScript tooling for the fastest builds. And in terms of some features of Next.js, it has some built-in optimizations for images, fonts, scripts, and different things like that that are going to improve your kind of core web vitals. So this is like what Google looks at for the performance of a web page. So it's going to be like time to first paint when you first see the page, how long it takes for your page to get interactive. Like I think it's time to first interactivity and different things like that. And it also has dynamic HTML streaming. So it allows you to kind of stream your UI or ship your UI in chunks rather than all at once, which can improve performance. It has React server components, so you can render components on the server and then ship them to the client. So you're not rendering everything on the client. And this is kind of along those same lines, client and server rendering. It has various CSS support, CSS modules, Tailwind, Sass, Style, JSX, all that, data fetching. You can make your React components async and await for your data right within components. You can fetch data straight from server components. It has Node.js as well as Edge runtimes and serverless functions, route handlers built in. It also has built-in routing, so a built-in file-based routing system, which we'll go over some examples of. And I just kind of talked about this, advanced routing, middleware, and a whole bunch of different features. So it is a pretty powerful full stack framework that allows you to build React applications a bit more easily. And honestly, when I build a new web application, Next.js is basically the first thing that I reach for. So with that, what are some prerequisites to Next.js? Well, as you might imagine, you should know React.js before moving on to Next.js, as Next.js, for the most part, is just a React application with some built-in structures. So knowing React is definitely important when moving to Next.js. Now, prerequisites for learning React, I would say, are for sure JavaScript, as React is, a lot of people say React is just JavaScript, but there's definitely some like added stuff with React that you have to learn when it comes to like JSX and component type of thinking and different things like that. So I wouldn't necessarily go as far to say that, but I would definitely say you use a lot of JavaScript in React. So you should probably know at least the fundamentals of JavaScript before moving to React. And then also just a general understanding of CSS and HTML is also a good idea, as those are the building blocks of the web. And if you have issues in your Next.js application, you still might need to use the inspector in your web browser and like go through the HTML DOM and kind of see where those errors are coming from. So a basic understanding of HTML and CSS, I think, are also good prerequisites to Next.js. Now, when I learned Next.js, I really didn't have much experience with working with databases and stuff like that. So I don't think you really need a ton of that stuff, but I would say it would still help to have some sort of understanding of Node.js, as well as kind of how databases work a little bit. So you're able to kind of build a more more full stack application, if that makes sense. So with that in place, let's now dive into like a few of the main core features here of Next.js. We're not going to touch all these, as I don't, I want this to be a getting started guide. I don't necessarily want it to be a like complete 7-hour tutorial. I want this to be like what's kind of the core information if you're brand new to Next.js, that you can kind of get started working with it. And I'll also give you some next steps of what I think you should learn next. So we're going to cover just a few of the main features. And the first one I want to cover is actually kind of not necessarily the advanced routing. I do have a video on advanced routing that I think it might have been my last video. I don't know. I'm trying to get ahead on videos kind of through Christmas and the holidays and stuff. So I think this video is going to come out later in January, but I'm recording this later in December. So I get confused sometimes on my upload schedule, but I do have a video on advanced routing that should already be out if you want to dive further into that. But we're going to cover just some basic routing. So the first thing that we're going to do here is actually head over to VS Code, and we're going to create a Next.js project from scratch, and then just kind of start showing these different features to you. So I'm here within VS Code, and the first thing I'm going to do is hit Control, I think backticks, and that's going to open up my terminal. I can't remember if that's a shortcut that I made for myself or if this is built into VS Code, but open your terminal here, and then we're going to create a new Next.js project. So what I'm going to do for this is run npx create -next-app at latest. So this is saying create just like the basic Next.js template with the latest version of Next.js. Then I'm going to hit return. I'm going to give it a name. I'll just say getting -started. We're not going to use TypeScript for this. No ESLint. We are going to use Tailwind. We're really not going to focus on the styling though. So I don't think you really need to use anything here if you don't want to, but just out of habit, I am going to use Tailwind because I generally do like using Tailwind for my Next.js apps. We're not going to use the SRC director, and we are going to use the app router, and I am not going to customize the default import alias. So this is going to get created here, and then I'm going to go up to the top and I'm going to go File, Open, and then open this project within VS Code. So I have my new project here, and what you're going to see is it's going to template out just a few different folders here for us. So of course we have our node modules, we have our next config or package.json. You can see that currently I am on Next.js 14.0.4. So this should be pretty close to what you have as well. I don't think it's going to be super important to have the same exact version as I do, unless there's like a major 15.0 release between the time I create this and the time you see this. But if you do, I'll be, of course, creating a video on the 15 release, so you can also see the differences there. But with that, we have our package.json and some other config files here at the root of our application. And we have a public folder with just a couple of assets in them, a couple of SVG images. And then here we have our app folder. And this is where like all of your components are going to go, as well as all of your different routes and stuff like that. So we have our page.js file. And if we first do npm run dev in the terminal and start this up and go to localhost 3000, you're going to see just this template that Next.js gave us out of the box here. So go ahead and run npm run dev and then go to localhost 3000, and you should see this page here. So here at localhost 3000, you should see this just basic template here that Next.js gives us out of the box. So all of this, so we can see like app/page.js, docs, learn, templates. If we go to our code here, we can see app/page.js, and then we should see somewhere like docs. So here we see templates, learn, docs, so on and so forth. So this is the HTML that's getting rendered on our page here. What's going on here is we have our app folder and then a page.js file. So in Next.js, this is how it does its routing. So it is a file-based routing system in which you create a route in Next.js by creating a folder. And then within that folder, you create a page.js file, or it could also be a page.js .sx file, and it could also be TS or TSX, but if you have a page.js file within a folder, that's going to create a public route. And the route is going to correspond to the name of the folder. Now, the root folder is just going to be at /. So your app folder is going to be at /. So that is going to be what is displayed with this page.jsx file. This is what we're going to see at just /. here. So at just our root file here, we see just this home page. We do not need to go to /app. That's not going to work. That's going to be and Next.js gives you a default 404 page if a route doesn't exist or a page doesn't exist. So within our app folder, the just base page.js file is what we're going to see when we're at just our root URL. Now, to create a different route, what we do is we create a folder. So I'm going to go within my app directory. So that's also important. The folder should be within your app directory, but I'm going to go new folder and let's just say blog. Now, within this blog, if I go to /blog, I'm still going to get a 404 because to make a public route, I need to add a page.js file. So like I could even have a component here that is like blog.jsx, and I could export default function blog and then just return an H1 that says blog. And I'm at /blog here. And if I refresh, I still don't see anything because I'm not actually rendering a page.js file. This is still a private component right here. But once I add a lowercase page.js or JSX or TS or TSX, this is going to be my public route. So I'm going to export the default function blog page. And then here, this is where I can return, maybe a main tag. And then, maybe I'll import my blog component and then render that here. So that's just an H1 that says blog. And then maybe I'll render a p tag that says, this is my blog in my blog page. And then here you see, now that I'm at /blog, I see my blog. This is my blog in my blog page because I made a page.jsx file within blog that created a public route here at /blog. And the only way this is a public route is if you make a page.js, JSX, TS, whatever file within it. And as you can see, we can create components within this folder as well and just use them right within my blog folder. So there's also a couple of different conventions when it comes to folder structure. Generally, I prefer to create a components folder within my app directory, like so, and then move all of my components within there and just keep my other folders with just like a page.js. You also have individual layout or loading files that you can use as well. But I like to keep my folders pretty clean and just put all of my components into a components folder. Now, and I am going to update those imports. So now I'm importing blog from components /blog. So now you can see I import blog from /components because my component is now within my blog folder. So that's generally my preferred approach. But if you knew that you're only going to use this blog component within your blog folder, it might make sense to kind of, put all of that just within this folder. So it's all kind of located close to where you're going to use it. But I would just make sure to keep it consistent. I prefer to just put all my components into a components folder. And then as you can see, we're not going to be able to go to /components here because I'm not creating a page.js file within my components page. But let's say I want to create an about page. Well, maybe go ahead and try this yourself. Create an about page and just say an H1 that says, this is my about page. But the way that we can do this is creating a new folder within our app directory called about. And then we just create a page.jsx file within that about page. And I'll just export a default function about that returns in each one saying about page. And then if I go back to my application and I go to / about, I see my about page. Now, what if I want to go to a settings page that's within my about page? That doesn't really make any sense, but I'm just going to do it to show you how to do a nested route. So what if I want to do / about / settings? Well, it's exactly what you think it would be. Within my about folder, I create another new folder called settings. And then I need to create a page.js file within my settings folder. And I can export default function about settings and then just return in each one that says about settings. And then if I come back and I go to / about / settings, I see about settings shows. So you create a new page by just creating a new folder and putting a page.js or ts or some sort of page file within that folder. But like we saw with components, if you don't put a page dot whatever file in there, it's not going to create a public route. This is going to be just almost like a private component here. Now, how can you navigate between these different pages? Well, there's a couple ways you can do it. One way is using a link. So let's go within my blog page here and let's add a link that goes to my about page. So the way that we can do this is just using a link component here from next / link. And then I can say, go to about page, and let me make it page. But now I also need to add an href of where I want to link to. And this can just be a relative URL. So I want to link to / about. And then if I go to my blog page here, I see go to about page. This is my link. And of course you could add styles here as well. But if I click on it, it navigates me to my about page. Now, what if I want to, instead of just using links, and maybe on my about page, let's go to the about page. Let's add a link, and I'm going to restructure this a little bit. Let's make this a main tag here. And then I will add within it, I'll add in each one, and that's where we'll put the about page. And then I'll add a link below it that is going to be a next link. And then we are going to set the href is going to go to blog page. And then within, I'll say go to blog page. If we come back within my about page, I now have go to blog page. And I can now link between these pages using next / link. So that's definitely the recommended way to link between pages, but how can you dynamically route between pages? Well, the way that we can do this is by routing programmatically using the next router. So I can say const router is equal to use router, and I want to import that from next navigation and make sure it's next navigation and not next router. And then make sure to call that function. But now when you have access to this router, you can use it much like how you'd use React router DOM if you've used that before. So you have access to router.push, and I think you have router.back, and then I think you could do router.refresh. There's a whole bunch of different things. You can look at the router API. But now for our go to blog page, instead of rendering a link here, let's just render a button component, and I will make this a button component. But then on click, we can pass in a function that will navigate them programmatically. So here you can imagine you have some logic, if the user is, their name is Ryan, then put a toast message saying, we're going to link you to the about page and then push them there. Some sort of logic you could add here. But all we're going to do is say router.push, and then we want to go to the blog page. So we can pass in a relative URL. Now, you're going to notice that this is not going to work here out of the box, but let's go look at this error. So coming back, let's go to the about page, and you're going to see we do have an error. And we are going to discuss this as our next topic. So this will lead us into it, but there's a couple of other routing things I do want to cover before that. Well, what you're going to see here is use router only works in client components. Add the use client directive at the top of the file to use it. So by default, Next.js components are rendered on the server. So we can't use a React feature on the server because these React hooks expect us to be within a client environment. So to fix that, and we'll explain client and server components in more detail later, I'm just going to put use client at the top of this file. And it's going to make it a client component. And now when I go back, you see everything works. And I click on go to blog page. It goes to my blog page and I can navigate back and forth using this programmatic routing with this router.push here. So hopefully that gives you a good idea on how to link between pages, as well as programmatically routing between pages using the router object. But now, what if you want to have dynamic routes? So what if you have a blog here, but you want to show them blog post number 1, blog post number 2, blog post number 3, so on and so forth. So based on the ID 1, 2, or 3, you want to show them blog number 1, 2, or 3. Well, the way that we can do that is add a new folder within our blog folder here. And to create a dynamic route, you use square brackets. And then within that square brackets, that's where you want to put a name for a dynamic value for when they navigate to this. So I'm going to use ID. And then I'm going to create this folder. And then within this folder, I'm going to create a page.jsx file. So what this is saying is that if I go to /blog/1, then my ID here is going to be 1. If I go to blog/2, I want it to be 2 and then show my second blog post. So what we can render out here is I can export a default function and I'll say blog post. And then I'm just going to return a main tag that says maybe an H1. This is blog number, and we'll just hard code 1 in for now. And that's all we'll put in here. So currently, if I go to blog/1, I see this is blog number 1. But if I go to /2, I see this is blog number 1. And 3, this is blog number 1, because we just hard coded it. So how can I actually use this ID here and render out the correct blog here? Well, since this is a dynamic route here with square brackets, we're automatically going to be passed a prop called params. And then on that prop is going to be the dynamic value. And the name of that dynamic value, or the property on the params object that we can access, is going to match the name of the folder. So we can say const blog ID is equal to params.id. So it's params.id because we used ID here as our folder name. And then we can render blog ID dynamically here as our blog number. So now if I come back, you see, I see blog number 3 because this is our dynamic value, our params.id. And now it's blog number 4. Now it's blog number 1. And you can imagine that if we actually had blogs with different ID numbers, we could just show the different blog posts for every ID here to dynamically show a different blog based on this ID. Now, if this name changed here, so let's say instead of ID, let's say we used blog ID. Well, it's no longer just going to be params.id here. And you're going to see I don't render out any number because now the property on this params object is going to be blog ID. It's going to match whatever name of this folder that we have. So now if I look, everything looks to be working again. So if I go to blog 10, it shows blog number 10. So that is how you can handle dynamic routes in Next.js. Hopefully that gives you a good idea on how you can create different routes using the file-based routing system, how you can programmatically route between pages using the router object like router.push, router.back, and then also using links, using next link between pages. But as I kind of showed you earlier, what page was this? This was this page. We needed to use a client component. So let's come back here and let's come back to the Next.js docs and come to their server components section, in which they explain React server components allow you to write UI that can be rendered and optionally cached on the server. Next.js, the rendering work is further split by route segments to enable streaming, partial rendering, and there are 3 different server rendering strategies: static, dynamic, and streaming. So what are the benefits of server rendering? Like why does Next.js have this server components feature in general? Well, for data fetching, server components allow you to move data fetching to the server closer to your data source. This can improve performance by reducing time it takes to fetch data needed for rendering. The amount of requests the client needs to make can also be reduced. Also, security. For server components, you can keep more sensitive data and logic on the server and not have to ship it to the client. Then also it allows some benefits regarding caching. It can reduce your bundle size. It can increase your first contentful paint, which is pretty similar to some of these performance benefits we mentioned earlier. You can potentially get better search engine optimization since your HTML can be rendered and indexed. And then you also have some streaming benefits. However, sometimes you don't want to use server components because, as I showed you earlier, when you're using a React hook like use router, or you need some like interactivity of your page, like this button, the user clicks on it. For that interactivity, we actually want this to be a client component here. So, client components are bad per se. There are benefits to server components like we talked about, but we also have client components. And as it says here, they allow you to write interactive UI that can be rendered on the client at request time. Next.js client rendering is opt-in, meaning you have to explicitly decide what components React should render on the client, which you opt in by using the use client directive at the top of the file, like what we did here. So this is us opting out of server rendering. And then the benefits of client rendering is basically interactivity. Client components can use state, effects, event listeners, and they can give immediate feedback to the user. And then also you have access to browser APIs like local storage, geolocation, and different things like that. So you're still probably going to need to use client components within your Next.js application. And the way that you can do that is using the use client directive at the top of your file. So right here, above your imports at the top of the file, you can make it use client. And this is used to declare a boundary between server and client component modules. This means that by defining a use client in a file, all other modules imported into it, including child components, are considered part of the client bundle, which is important to remember. So importing all other modules into a client component effectively make those other modules or include those other modules into your client bundle. Now, Next.js also has this nice little diagram when to use server and client components. So for a server component, when you need to fetch data, access backend resources directly, use sensitive information, keep large dependencies on the server, but you'll use client components when you need to use event listeners and interactivity. So on click, on change, when you need to use state and lifecycle events like use state, use effect, use reducer, and other React hooks, browser only APIs like local storage, use custom hooks that depend on state effects or browser APIs, or if you're using React class components, which hopefully you're not needing to do that. And then Next.js also goes on to recommend to, use server components where you can, but it's also helpful to move client components down the component tree. So you're basically making as much of your application a server component as possible. And then you can import client components into a server component, and that will still keep it a server component. So like this is a server component here, but you can render or import a client component here, which is the search bar. So this is something that is like highly interactive, but you can also import in server components, like just a logo, and that's totally fine to do as well. And this entire component here is still going to be a server component, but you're just injecting this client component. So a good way that I like to think about it is that your kind of structure is your server components, but then you can leave in like little slots to fill in with interactivity. And I've heard people also think about this as like islands of interactivity. So if you have a full homepage and the only thing that's interactive in that page is a search bar, well, you wouldn't really want to make that entire homepage a client component. You would want to make a search bar component that is a client component and just slot that in to your server component. So let's go back here. And instead of making this all a server component, how could I adjust this about page to actually just kind of slot in a client component? Well, what we can do is we can create a new component here, and I'll just call this maybe button navigation.jsx. And then this can be a client component. And then I can export a default function button navigation. Maybe it will accept a path. And then I will just return a button. And it will say, maybe I'll say path and label. And it will render out this label. And on click, what we will do is we will pass in a function or an inline function that will use the router to navigate to this path. So I'll say const router is equal to use router from next navigation here. Make sure to call that. And then here I will say router push, and we'll just pass in the path here. And now in my about page, instead of making this a client component, I'm going to remove this. I'm also going to remove this, and then we will just slot in our client component. So I will now use my button navigation, and we need to pass it a path. And I think we're going to route to the /blog page, and then I'll pass it a label here, and I'll just say go to blog. And now if I come back to localhost 3000, we're at the blog here. So let's go to the about page. I see go to blog. There's no errors here. And I can navigate back and forth between these pages just like before. But now instead of making this entire component a client component, I'm just slotting in this client component here. So in this example, of course, it's not going to be a big deal to make this little component here a client component, but you can imagine like in a full about page here, I might have several different components in here that, I don't want to make everything a client component. That's kind of the gist on server and client components. I would say default to server components, but when you need some interactivity, most likely just create like a small client component and slot that in to your server components. And then the final fundamental that I want to discuss here is, let's go back maybe to just our home page here. So in our root page, let's discuss data fetching. So there's kind of two primary ways that you can fetch data. You can do it from server components or client components. I would say generally when you can, try to fetch data in your server components, but I'm going to show you how you do it in both. So for this blog page here, let's go ahead and let's make a request to an API, and I will show you how to fetch data here. So let's go to my browser here, and I'm going to go to a new URL, and this is jsonplaceholder.typeofcode.com. This is just like a free API that allows us to get some data from this kind of server here. So as you can see, we can fetch to this URL, and then we can eventually use that to do. So I'm going to copy this right here, right from their homepage. and come back to the blog page. And then let's say for me to create a function that fetches this data above my blog page, I'm just going to create an async function called fetch to do. And I'm going to paste in what I just copied from that page. But I'm actually going to go const res is equal to, and we're going to actually await this fetch. And then I'm going to say const data is equal to await res.json. And then we're just going to return the data from this function. And yes, you should probably also wrap this in a try catch block, but for the sake of this tutorial, we're not going to worry about that too much. So now how can I call this function within this server component here? And notice it's a server component because we don't use the use client directive here. Well, it's actually almost exactly what you think. All we need to do is convert blog page to an async function here. And then all I need to do is say const to do is equal to await. And then I can just call fetch to do. And then maybe below my paragraph, we will just render out the to do. So now if I come back to locals 3000 at my blog page, I see objects are not valid as React child. So that tells me that this to do is actually an object here. So let's go ahead and console log the to do to see what this comes back as. So I'll console log it. And then let me refresh. And then I should see my to do in my console here somewhere. And you see it's to do is title completed. So I'll just do to do.title is what we'll render out. So I will say, let's just destructure title from my fetch to do function. And then I'll render out my title here. And I'll remove that console.log. So now we see this is the to do that we just fetched. So we fetched that from a server component. So pretty straightforward to fetch data from server components. Like I really like this. It's super easy to do. But what if this was a client component? How would we do it then? Well, we would have to go back to how you fetch data in like normal React applications. So here we would first, let's make this a client component. So use client. And then let's also say that, and I'm not going to make this an async function anymore, because what we're going to have to do is fetch this on mount of this client component. So I'm going to say const to do comma set to do is equal to use state. And then I'll just do an empty string. And then now we need to fetch this to do on mount. So we're going to do use effect from React, import that, and then I'm going to call it, pass in an inline function. I'm going to say async function get to do. And what this function is going to do is it's just going to set the to do, and it's going to wait fetch to do, and I'm going to call it. And then all we need to do is make sure to call this get to do function. And the reason I'm doing this is because we can't pass in an async function immediately to use effect, because then it's going to return a promise, and we can't return a promise from this function. And we're just going to run this on mount. And now I have my to do here. So the only thing that I need to change here is I need to say this is going to be to do dot title. And then I can also say if not to do, return an H1 that just says loading. So use state is not defined. I need to make sure to import use state from React. So I have those imports there. And now if I refresh my page, you see loading for a split second here. And then I have my same to do here that is rendered. And I'm making this client request now. And just to show you as well, once I have my to do, I can also say console.log to do. But when I refresh here, I'm no longer going to see this to do. And this is just the error that I was getting earlier. But I no longer see the to do in my console here in Node.js. I'm going to see it in my browser console. So that's something to keep in mind as well. So I see my to-do right here because I'm now console logging this within a client component. So just keep in mind when you're console logging stuff in a client component, it's going to be in your browser console, but in a server component, it's going to be just on your terminal, your running terminal here within Node.js. All right. So that is how you can fetch data with server and client components. I'll generally try to fetch data with server components for the benefits that we talked about earlier from the Next.js docs. But I think those are some couple of good things to know when getting started with Next.js. So with what I've taught you here about routing as well as server and client components as well as data fetching, you can really go a long ways with what I've taught you today. So I think this is a great place to kind of stop here for this getting started guide, but I would consider some next steps here. So for one, I would probably learn about Next.js route handlers. So Next.js has this built-in route handler system or built-in API. I would learn about that. I have videos on that. And then also learning about server actions. They're also very cool. I have a full 40-minute video on those. And also learning about caching as well as middleware. I would say those are a few good areas to kind of explore next within Next.js. And once you kind of get a grasp on those, you can definitely build some really cool applications. So hopefully this helped as just kind of an introduction, getting started guide. But thanks for tuning into this. Let me know what you want to see next from me, and I'll see you in that next one.